Hello.
Hi.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Police Project podcast series. Today we are here with Nosheen Ali. Thanks, Nosheen, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Nosheen Ali is a sociologist and a professor, and she's currently serving as global faculty in residence at the Gallatin School at New York University. She works on state-making, ecology, and Muslim cultural politics in South Asia, with a focus on Gilgit-Baltistan and Kashmir. Her book, Delusional States, Feeling Rule and Development in Pakistan's Northern Frontier, is the first ethnographic study of the state-making and social change in Gilgit-Baltistan and was released by Cambridge University Press in 2019. I want to start from your book.
Okay.
Which I recommend to everyone because it's an incredible piece of anthropology and ethnography with this humanizing and displacing, I would say, accent on emotional and affective politics. So highly recommended.
Okay.
So let's start from the way you look at education. So schools and school curricula play a very important role in shaping the identity of a nation. And this is something you've explored in great depth in your book. And you looked in particular at the Gilgit-Baltistan situation and how the sectarian identity and conflict play a role through education. Could you let us know what are the core elements in this relation?
Yes. When we look at sectarian politics in Pakistan, the focus has traditionally been on religious parties, regional geopolitics, and political actors, right? A very particular notion of what counts as politics. And there has been a lot of conversation on madrasas and madrasa curriculum as well. What I found really interesting in Gilgit-Baltistan during my fieldwork was that there was a textbook controversy. Now, it was called a textbook controversy, but more than 100 people had died. Schools were closed for 11 months. Huge state violence and intersect violence was taking place. And all over so-called secular textbooks, the textbooks that are used in ordinary schools, government schools as well as private schools in Gilgit-Baltistan. So I was very intrigued. I was very intrigued by the fact that there is a social movement going on led by the Shia clergy, but with a huge base of Shia communities in Gilgit-Baltistan. And as you know, Gilgit-Baltistan is a Shia-majority space as well in Sunni-dominated Pakistan. So I thought that the conflict over textbooks brought to fore, what is religion, what is citizenship, and what is education in Pakistan. And that's why I focus on that aspect of sectarian conflict. When we think of sectarian conflict, even we don't think textbooks. We don't, but that was the reality in Gilgit-Baltistan at the time, and it was hugely dismissed as well. The movement, oh, it's religious. People were downplaying the core demands, and the core demand was for a representative curriculum. The core demand was that the kind of Islam, the kind of religion, actually, and the kind of content that our textbooks are putting out are hugely against the cultural fabric of the nation as well as the region. They are becoming more and more Sunni dominant, but also Sunni dominant in a perverse way. They are focusing too much uh, on majoritarian hegemony, if you like. So that was being resisted vociferously in Gilgit-Baltistan over 2000 and 2005, and eventually the leader of the movement was also shot dead. So that's what I was discussing in the book. Now, eventually, what happened was that they had to withdraw the textbooks. So, in some ways, the movement was successful. And its key demand was not just about the Islamia textbooks, that's another clarification I want to make, but they did an excellent analysis of the Urdu textbooks and the drawing textbooks and social science textbooks, all of which are promoting more and more religious intolerance. And 10 years on, 15 years on, we see that that issue has not gone away. We see in our universities that this kind of fundamentalist view of society, which is anti minority, which is, I would even say, anti Islam, is being perpetuated as the way to teach. So I thought that was very interesting, and it showed the courage of people. Of course, it was devastating because it heightened sectarian anxieties because of state intervention and the way it was brutally crushed. But the significance was that the movement's claim was for a more egalitarian citizenship. And that is often missed. The movement's aim was questioning who counts as a citizen in modern day Pakistan. So,
And I think this, just a follow-up question on this, it's very interesting because somehow what it seems that you do is to question the very polarization between what is secular and what is religious. Because through the religious argument, people were asking for a more representative, secular education. So could you expand a bit on this? Because it's very interesting how this, stark black and white
yes,
opposition that is used as a rhetorical argument doesn't hold at all in the case that you're discussing.
no. Uh, and thank you for asking that. I think I was pretty stunned by the fact that we think certain kinds of demands which are progressive come from people who look a certain way,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I was interviewing these members of the Imam Barga in Gilgit, and the Imam Barga, the central Shia mosque in Gilgit, was uska matlab, how do I say this, it was surrounded, it was attacked. There's a photograph that actually I have not put in the book. There was a limitation, but it's a gunshot view of the central Shia masjid in Gilgit. So it was an active confrontation with the state. It was a regional level confrontation. By it was a popular movement as well. I mean, there were differences within the Shia community. So I don't want to homogenize that, oh, there was this Shia resistance against the state. There were many perspectives within the Shia communities. Some were like, be cautious. Is this really worth our time? Our doctors are being killed. We are facing high profile target killings all over Pakistan. Do we want to waste our time over the curriculum? The pro movement supporters were saying, yes, it is a specific demand. It's a small demand, but it has huge consequences for shaping the identity of our youth. And it's also an achievable demand. There are many things that you can't achieve, but it felt education is close to people's heart, and they do not want their identities being negated in the public curriculum where their students are studying. So I was pretty taken aback by the vision of the clergy there, because they were like, at one point, this person who was one of the leading members of the movement and was affiliated with the central Shia mosque in Gilgit said to me, why are people like me in charge of the curriculum in the first place? The curriculum is for scholars to decide. Why have you handed it to Maulvis? I mean, we're talking, this is the Punjab textbook board. Why is it dominated by a particular ideology, and an ideology that is rabidly anti-Shia? You know, so he said that our problem is not just one textbook. Our problem is starts from the top. Why does Gilgit not have a separate textbook board? Where do our books come from? Who is writing these books? These books were being written by 4 Sunni scholars. Why?
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't, so I think it the demands went all the way from textbooks to the politics of education to representative democracy. How do you have a democratic process for designing the educational policy of Gilgit-Baltistan, which I thought that's when the violence against the movement really started, because it could no longer be seen as a religious movement or a movement about textbooks, but about centrally about political rights and self-determination. Because because Gilgit-Baltistan, as you know, is an internationally disputed part of the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, it does not have, it's in limbo, its constitutional status is in limbo, and it does not have the right to define its own education. So people linked the demand for a separate textbook board to the right to self-representation.
So, like this, you're opening a wider, a wider panorama, and I would like to zoom out a little bit because if we look at the contemporary neo-colonial time and the imperialist project of the war on terror, education becomes a very contested geopolitical terrain in which the Muslim other is constructed within a discourse of humanitarianism and development. This is a very complex and intricate underplay. Could you help us untangle all this?
Yeah, it's. I didn't intend for my book to have 3 chapters on education. It just so happened that, and secular education, right? So called secular education. It just so happened that so much of politics was happening in what is happening in higher education and in primary education in Gilgit-Baltistan. So I think what you're referring to here is the way in which even like the book Three Cups of Tea by a very famous humanitarian idol came across to many people as countering prejudice. Because it did not say that Muslims are bad. It said Muslims are very good. In fact, they saved my life when I was a mountaineer. So this is Greg Mortenson's personal travel in Baltistan. But it quickly goes from producing the rural as ignorant, which is actually very untrue because Gilgit-Baltistan has a very high education rate. And the landscape of education is not barren at all there, to saying that the rural ignorant is extremist because of poverty, because they have to join the madrasas. And so, if the Western imperial project can only create schools, and especially girls' schools, then we will resolve the problem of terrorism. Now, there are big jumps in logic here. So, Islam goes from the very active Orientalist other to through tropes of poverty and development as the poor Muslim, the poor, ignorant, vulnerable to radicalization Muslim other. So I thought it was very interesting where development was used for counterinsurgency. Mona Bhan has done excellent work on Indian occupied Kashmir, on how development becomes a rhetoric for Indian imperialism uh, in Kashmir elsewhere. So yeah, I think savior humanitarianism is a problem, and this kind of narrative that Three Cups of Tea perpetuated was actually filled with lies. And when I tried to publish on it, was actively silenced. People would not believe it. Like, I've done field work. It's not the birthplace of the Taliban. It was not just ill intentioned. We know now how implicated the whole project of education led by Greg Mortenson was implicated in the counterinsurgency practices of US empire. So yeah, education it seems benign. It's a way to win hearts and minds. That was the rhetoric of the Bush times. And we saw it fail. We saw it fail. People saw through it, and he was exposed. And I think the problem that I was trying to expose was beyond him. I was trying to say, what are transnational regimes of representation that try to educate a global public on a place like Gilgit-Baltistan, but totally get it wrong, because you have this violent uh, erasure of Muslim geographies, and you try to fit them into palatable narratives in which the American um, empire seems benevolent and necessary almost.
I think in both things that you just discussed, both this developmental ideology and specifically also in relation to the earlier discussion about the textbook controversy, what seems to come to the fore is a sort of a perpetuation of certain inequalities. And so here we are, perhaps will be interesting to discuss a little further is how all this plays in terms of representation and construction of truths.
Yeah, I think it's lovely to talk to you about this, because when you look at our national textbooks, they are marginalizing Gilgit-Baltistan in a particular way, according to the people who led the mobilization against textbooks. If you look at international humanitarian narratives and successful popular books like Three Cups of Tea, which are global, they've been translated in 30 languages, um, and serve as the fundamental way in which the books not bombs narrative was put forward. Oh, it's supposed to be anti-war. There's nothing to do with empire here. Their education becomes a way not just to marginalize, but to order a narrative of terror. You order a narrative of terror in a way that your racism is not visible so straightforwardly. And I think what you're asking about, the regime of truth, is absolutely um, on, because the way the homogenization happens, we have to ask what is being silenced, whose version of truth is being promoted here. And we see this in development narratives a lot, right? So I also talk in the book about pastoral identities. If you look at conservation practices, a lot of work on wildlife now actually acknowledges that the farmers were right in their approach to wildlife in many ways, but it will be framed as a Western discourse. Um, so I look at the narrative on education as part of a global developmentalist discourse in which the rural, the Muslim, the Shia might all be seen as 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 identities to be silenced. And even in Islam, in the Islamic curriculum, I mean, growing up in Pakistan, we were always told there's one Islam. So of course that Islam is coded as Sunni, and it's not only coded as Sunni. Increasingly, it's coded as a very strict, um, very very perverse uh, aspect of Sunni Islam that you choose to describe as national, as common, and there's no contestation about it. The idea is not that there's one Islam or not one Islam. The idea is, what are you doing to the pluralistic identities that are present in the landscape that you're seeking to represent or you're seeking to educate? Are you honoring them, or are you annihilating them? That's the question that both the imperial and the national narratives pose for education.
Yeah, I mean, what is really interesting here is how, supposedly when you talk, as you mentioned earlier, when you talk about education, you're not talking about politics.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that is a massive fiction because
Yeah, it's central to ideologies of nationalism and in Pakistan, militarism.
yeah, and I want to pick up on this because so you know Mortensen and the textbook controversy are quite old, but things don't seem to have changed much. Pakistan 10 years on, right? And I mean, it's a news of the last July, July 2020, that the government of Pakistan pushed for a so-called unification of the madrasa, the Urdu medium, and the English medium education. And what was not so disguised was the fact that there was a clear inclination towards a more religious and conservative direction. This in itself is something worth discussing, but also I want you to comment on this, but also I want you to comment on the fact that this potentially opens a massive controversial space on where does censorship operates, where does self-censorship come into play, and also opens the very, very problematic issue of what may be deemed objectionable content with all the potential political and legal consequences that such things have. So I'm sorry, there are two questions in one, but I would like you to...
No, it's a very it's absolutely essential to talk about this, and thank you for bringing that up. I think this is long in the making, this current move. We see centralizing tendencies of our government post the 70s, you know, when they come up with Islam as the national ideology of education. If you read the goals of the social science curriculum, they're not different from the goals of a cadet college or of a military training camp. You know, jihad and anti-India posture and extremely antagonistic ideas of Muslims and Hindus, extremely distorted visions of history are being used to are being represented as Islam, right? So that's the first problem. The second problem, for me, the biggest problem with the SNC is who is taking the decisions. We've had textbook boards and we've had a huge movement for provincial rights in Pakistan for as long as I can remember. And the idea there is that we need to empower people to make decisions. So you see a lot of headway that the Sindh textbook board and the KP textbook board have made. The Punjab textbook board tried, I believe, with Shehbaz Sharif, and they had to back off, right? It's not a coincidence that the biggest textbook board, Punjab textbook board, there is a monopoly over what counts as religion and over what is going to be taught in textbooks. And those are the textbooks that circulate most prominently in Gilgit-Baltistan as well. So I think you can produce very good content. You can say, oh, look, we considered this, and oh, this is our culture, so we're going to do this. But who are you? Is this a technocratic approach? Is this a depoliticized approach? Who has the stake in figuring out how we're going to teach the next generation? And I don't think the SNC curriculum came at a time where the 18th Amendment was being dismissed. So these things are not disconnected, right? There are already ways in which you are undermining people's movements, you're undermining people's rights at all levels. When women ask for their rights, it's a problem. When Shias are saying, don't kill us, don't accuse us of blasphemy, it's a problem. When PTM is talking about removing checkpoints and basically don't kill us, it's a problem. So you can't have a single national curriculum that from the top ordained like an ordinance and then presume that that's a space for unity. Because look, we do some very good chapters on citizenship. No, it's the process that's important. It's not a project. Education is always a process. And I wholeheartedly believe that change is definitely necessary, but I want to say absolutely clearly that it will not be a militaristic project.
Thank you.
That's what it is. I mean, we have to look at education as enhancing the democratic, pluralistic vision of society. And if it's coming from the wrong sides, which is, used to brainwash people and reduce the space for dissent, because higher education is under attack for a long time, at least since Ayub, where education was technicalized. Famously, he went to Dhaka University and saw the faculty members protest and student protests, and he realized that let's make education a technocratic project. So we have a history of education being used by military dictators to shore themselves up and to create enough liberalism, like 3 cups of tea. There's enough liberal purchase so that you don't see the active violence that you're committing in the name of education as well.
I want to go back to the other part of my question and the whole risk of censorship and self-censorship, because I think this is a massive problem at the moment, and so is the fact that statements may be considered objectionable content.
Yeah.
So what are the consequences of this? What are the political consequences of what seems seemingly innocent move of unify a curriculum that then creates censorship and that induces self-censorship and then may create, as you said, a prosecution of dissent? Because
Yes.
anything that
Yes.
is against, the mainstream becomes objectionable, and hence,
Yeah. No, it totally empowers a particular lobby that is trying to strike some balance between, like, sort of have a veneer of democracy by saying, oh, look, we brought in such good education policies, by removing the politics out of the question. And I think what is happening, which we've seen for a long time, is that religion becomes that crutch to silence. Right? If someone talks about women's rights, you're going to say anti-Islam. You talk about provincial rights, you're going to say, acha, these people are Shia, these people are this and that. So I think that's my fear. I look at this as a threat to democracy. And somebody was asking me about, oh, what do you think? Isn't the social science curriculum good? I'm like, it really, again, because you're asking in terms of consequences, we are under so-called a hybrid regime, uh, in which people are getting picked up. Their extrajudicial disappearances are happening regularly without any letting up, even during a pandemic. Below students are being killed. I think what is really happening to educate society in terms of the landscape are the student marches. Are Balot students and Punjabi students getting together and saying, where are we? I have enormous hope that it will be their aspirations and the fact that they've been completely shut down from from anything happening in the country. Right? The scale of violence has been so high that education is not the space to breathe that it usually is, and it should be in most democratic spaces. So I'll give you an example here in terms of fear. I think what you're saying, referring to here with censorship, is what journalists are facing, what academics are facing, what students are facing. I attended a progressive gathering in Karachi in December, and different students were, it was a student dialogue. Private school students were talking about securitization on campus, which is a huge problem, which I want to talk about as well. The land grab that is happening uh, with the support of the army is immensely important to understand. That higher education, you can't just change the curriculum and pretend that universities are breathing, have a lot of space. No, higher education is actively being countered, not just through these curriculum and conservative elements being introduced, as you were saying, but also through taking over hostels, taking over buildings. Like, if I talk to faculty members in Karachi, many of them are struggling with the rangers not taking over their hostels. I mean, these
like,
are the
physically taking over.
physically taking over the hostels, physically taking over the hostels. There's been a raging battle in Sindh University also regarding land grab, not just by many, by the political mafia, if you like. So the active physical space of universities are also often threatened. But so it was interesting that private universities were, students were talking about securitization, they were also talking about sexual harassment. Students from Karachi University were talking about the fact that when we sit in the canteen, we fear we will get picked up. You talk to people from Balochistan and their fear is next level, right? So censorship is one thing, and the right to exist, the right to talk, um, I mean, the level of, I guess, militarization of society, militarization of education, militarization of the space of the university, huge gender segregation as well. I mean, the entire effort is James Ferguson has an excellent book called The Anti-Politics Machine, Development as an Anti-Politics Machine, that the World Bank comes in and does all these development projects so that people will shut up and not talk about rights, so that we don't have to see popular social movements. So we see that in Lesotho. We see that in many of the practices of modern states. And I think this kind of curricular projects is another anti-politics machine, that you do not want students to ask political questions. Political questions, by the way, when we say politics, what do we mean? We mean, how are we going to create an equal citizenship where we have space to learn, where we have space to respect each other, where we have tolerance? At the minimum, we should learn to coexist, right? And then I can think about whatever else I want to study.
Mm-hmm. I think messages in this direction have been quite clear, because it was last May that several liberal outspoken academics have been fired on preposterous reasons. So I think those are not as bad as obviously disappearances, but they seem to me very clear messages on what are the consequences if people dare to speak up.
Yeah, there's an intellectual blackout. There's an intellectual blackout for sure. And in higher education, you will not be allowed to survive, because the monopoly over the discourse has to be a particular narrative. And that narrative we all know. If you say any, I mean, professors have gotten disappeared in Karachi University. That's what I mean. If you're not physically safe, what are you going to teach? I'd also like to share, I mean, I was teaching citizenship education at a private university in Karachi. And I said, okay, let's begin with the Constitution. Do you know your Constitution? Let's look at the fundamental rights. There's a clause about arbitrary detention, that you cannot do arbitrary detention, and you have to appear. I mean, the person has to be produced in court. And one of my students said, it was pretty remarkable to me, Miss, I don't want to study this. I'm getting scared. I understood where she's coming from. That is the censorship operates at a cultural social level such that the Constitution is scary. The same Constitution that people in Gilgit-Baltistan are fighting for, they're yearning for. That's the argument of my book, that not belonging to a nation and not having rights has been a huge source of marginalization and invisibilization for people of Gilgit-Baltistan. And yet people in Karachi, which is where I'm from, who have supposedly this privilege of rights and constitution, are like, ooh, the Constitution sounds too political. Do we really need to study it? It's an actual question in a graduate program. Sincerely asked. That's the level of fear. Like, I mean, it's without censorship.
So, Nosheen, we've covered a lot of ground, and I want to ask you one last question that I think brings sort of everything we've discussed together. You just mentioned the yearning of the people in Gilgit-Baltistan to belong, and you used this beautiful expression of their longing to belong. Mm-hmm. And I want to expand this expression a little beyond the province, because and I want to understand, because we were talking about citizenship, and citizenry means belonging to a common project.
Absolutely.
So I want to ask you to tell us more about this idea of longing to belong in a situation in which the state, that should be the one that protects its citizens, seems to in fact play a fairly antagonistic, if not openly confrontational role.
Yeah. You know, there are so many ironies in Gilgit-Baltistan, in the political predicament of Gilgit-Baltistan. They fought a war of independence against the Dogra regime in Kashmir. Um, and I think we have to take seriously what the desire for Muslim nationhood meant at a particular time. Um, and they've been denied constitutional rights, many political rights. Uh, for the longest time, the area was called Federally Administered Northern Areas, or FANA. Uh, the whole region was invisible. हम गुमशुदगी की बात करते हैं तो इलाकाई, like it's like regionally disappeared. It would not appear on the maps that we studied in school. And I talk about this in the book. This kind of depeopling of the region, where, as you know, Pakistani, uh, there is so much emotional attachment nowadays over the last 10 years, specifically with Gilgit-Baltistan being our beauty and roof of the world and heaven on earth. And oh my God, I found myself in Gilgit and I attended this workshop. And you know, there is a nostalgic plus romantic tourist imaginary of Gilgit-Baltistan that overshadows the political repression of the region on a day-to-day level. For example, more than 100 activists under the ATA, the Anti-Terrorism Act, have been booked under Schedule 4, which means you have to report to the police, you're constantly harassed, your families are harassed, you cannot leave town. I have had students who've been booked under ATA, right? And this has only expanded. So it's when people don't have rights, it's they the kind of affirmative surrender that I witnessed in Gilgit-Baltistan, and of course, this has a lot to do with military employment in the region as well. Families have a huge history of being employed in first the Gilgit Scouts and then the Pakistani army. There is a huge sense of moral belonging to Pakistan, to the project of Pakistan, to a Muslim nation, except that it's seen through a lens now, what I call a state of manipulated love, that all we have gotten is betrayal and packages after packages that have further disenfranchised us and entrenched central control, non local control, rather than active, substantive citizenship. So I argue in the book that there is a poetics of love through which we can understand political subjectivity. And I've been told later that people can relate with this in other parts of Kashmir, even in Fata, that, you know, the language of resistance, we need to understand the affective language of resistance. When people talk about uh, the ehsas merumi, which is the inferiority or the sense of deprivation that we feel, they're not just saying that we don't have XYZ law applied to Gilgit-Baltistan. They are talking seriously about the emotionality of belonging. And even if today you see the resistance movements in Pakistan, they will claim loyalty. They are constantly claiming love, which they don't need to, but they're forced in this position of love, loyalty, and betrayal, which I theorize at length in the book. I think it's the I think that might be the case in many places which are stateless, but with hugely oppressive state structures, nevertheless imposed on them. But not having representation in parliament, not having representation in many of the economic decision making in the country means that there is a one way landlord-servant relationship. And many people call Gilgit-Baltistan, especially on the left, as the last colony. We've been colonized, that we never saw a difference between the colonial period and the post-colonial period, which is true.
Just to conclude, I mean, again, I'm really fascinated by this notion of belonging to belong, and it's something I want to keep with me as a sort of hopeful project of resistance. Because ideally, we all want to belong to a state that represents us.
Yes,
So
yes.
can that be a sort of a hopeful way to look ahead? Because I mean, we're living in pretty dire times. And I want to close in a hopeful note.
I think the recent Hunza sit-in is very hopeful because it reflects popular struggle. For the people who've been arrested since the Atabad tragedy, about Baba Jan, and we were just talking about the Asirane Hunza, the prisoners who were at first, they were displaced by the Atabad Lake and they were protesting for their rights, and a father and son were shot at. So there are people who've been in jail for 6 years, and the family members, especially women of Hunza, did a sit-in for days and nights in this cold to get the political prisoners released. And the issue of political prisoners, I think Baba Jan is now the longest serving political prisoner. Definitely in Gilgit-Baltistan, but as seen in rest of Pakistan as well. I think that is hopeful. I think we can only combine our resistances, and I think even that resistance is an act of affirmation. It is saying that yes, we want you, but we want you with representation and dignity. We don't want like a kagas. We don't want just a legal document. This is not some kind of paper that we're demanding autonomy. We're demanding respect, and all the provinces in Pakistan actually are. That's what the claim is, right? That they are demanding respect. What is really ironic is that the battle for self-determination is not just happening in Gilgit-Baltistan. It's happening in Balochistan, it's happening in KP, it's happening in Sindh, and now Punjab has joined forces. So it's a very exciting time to see. I feel it's a decolonization movement where we have to restart and we have to say what is the national contract? What is the meaning of citizenship? Because there has been huge rise in fascist politics all over South Asia. I mean, you cover the Polis project covers India very well, and we know that if you're going to use religion as a source of terror, that's not the nationalism we want. And my book makes a case for the poetic, the educational, and the ecological movements. Usually they're little studied, they're not seen as properly political, but these are cultural movements, they're ecological movements which happen in the shadow of the Kashmir conflict. And what they teach us is local cultural vocabularies of people. I spend a lot of time looking at the language of insaniyat in poetry, for example, in which they're always arguing for a better humanity. And that is very important for progressive movements to consider. This our cultural lineage of protest as well, which is not always just in elections. It is not just for, give me a fifth province. It's beyond that. It is for creating harmony in society at the local level, you know. So, yeah, I think Gilgit-Baltistan has a lot to teach us, and I hope the book is a contribution to that.
It is indeed. And I recommend it highly to everyone. Thank you so much, Nosheen, for being with us.
Thank you. This was so wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.